Unlike his evolutionist grandfather, Erasmus, whose scientific verse was, somewhat surprisingly, I have to say, admired by Coleridge and Wordsworth, Charles Darwin was not known as a poet, but he rose to a lyrical crescendo in the last paragraph, the famous last paragraph of The Origin of Species. Thus, from the war of nature, from famine and death, the most exalted object which we are capable of conceiving, namely the production of the higher animals, directly follows. There is grandeur in this view of life, with its several powers having been originally breathed into a few forms or into one, and that whilst this planet has gone cycling on according to the fixed law of gravity, from so simple a beginning, endless forms most beautiful and most wonderful have been and are being evolved. That evolved is the only mention of the word in The Origin of Species. There's a lot packed into that famous peroration, and what I'm going to do is to base my lecture upon it, taking it line by line. Clear-headed as ever, Darwin recognized the moral paradox at the heart of his great theory. He didn't mince words, but he offered the comforting reflection that nature has no evil intentions. Things simply follow from laws acting all around us, to quote an earlier sentence from the same paragraph. He'd said something similar at the end of chapter 7 of The Origin. It may not be a logical deduction, but to my imagination it is far more satisfactory to look at such instincts as the young cuckoo ejecting its foster brothers, ants making slaves, the larvae of Ichneumonidae feeding within the live bodies of caterpillars, not as specially endowed or created instincts, but as small consequences of one general law, leading to the advancement of all organic beings, namely, multiply, vary, let the strongest live, and the weakest die. One of the reasons historians sometimes advance for Darwin's loss of faith was his revulsion at the cruelty, or rather the callous indifference of nature. This was not just an incidental fact. Darwin realized that it followed from the theory of natural selection itself. He had a particular thing about the female ichneumon wasp's habit of stinging its victim to paralyze but not kill it, keeping the meat fresh for its larva as it eats the live prey from within. I cannot persuade myself, Darwin wrote, I cannot persuade myself that a beneficent and omnipotent God would have designedly created the Ichneumonidae with the express intention of their feeding within the living bodies of caterpillars. The picture there is not actually an ichneumon wasp, it's a digger wasp, Ammophila, which does the same thing. According to Fabre, the story is even more macabre, because the wasp methodically stings the caterpillar in each ganglion all the way down the chain of ganglia at the front of the caterpillar's body, so that it stays alive but can't move. Darwin couldn't persuade himself that a beneficent creator would conceive such a habit, but with natural selection in the driving seat, all becomes clear, understandable, sensible. Natural selection cares naught for any comfort. Why should it? For something to happen in nature, the only requirement is that the same happening in ancestral times assisted the survival of the genes promoting it. Gene survival is a sufficient explanation for the cruelty of wasps, the callous indifference of all nature. Sufficient and satisfying to the intellect, if not to human compassion. Yes, there is grandeur in this view of life, and even a kind of grandeur in nature's serene indifference to the suffering that inexorably follows in the wake of its guiding principle, survival of the fittest. Theologians, and I'm sure there are many of those present today, should feel free to wince at this echo of a familiar ploy in theodicy, in which suffering is seen as an inevitable correlate of free will. Biologists, for their part, will find inexorably, by no means too strong a word, when they reflect on the biological function of the capacity to suffer. Suffering is there for a reason. It's a signal that all is not well, a signal to the animal to do something to reduce the suffering. If animals are not suffering, somebody, a predator perhaps, or a parasite, isn't working hard enough at the business of gene survival. Scientists are human, and they are as entitled as anyone to revile cruelty and abhor suffering. But good scientists like Darwin recognize that truths about the real world have to be faced, however distasteful. If we're going to admit subjective considerations, there is a fascination in the bleak logic that pervades all of life, including wasps homing in on the nerve ganglia down the length of their prey, including cuckoos ejecting their foster brothers, slave-making ants, and the single-minded, or rather zero-minded, indifference to suffering shown by all parasites and predators. Darwin was bending over backwards to console when he concluded his chapter on the struggle for survival with these words: "All we can do is to keep steadily in mind that each organic being is striving to increase at a geometrical ratio, that each at some period of its life, during some season of the year, during each generation or at intervals, has to struggle for life and to suffer great destruction. When we reflect on this struggle, we may console ourselves with the full belief that the war of nature is not incessant, that no fear is felt, that death is generally prompt, and that the vigorous, the healthy, and the happy survive and multiply." I wish I believed that no fear is felt. Shooting the messenger is one of humanity's sillier foibles, and it underlies a good slice of the opposition to evolution that is so lamentably widespread, especially in America. Teach children that they are animals and they'll behave like animals. Even if it were true that evolution, or the teaching of evolution, encouraged immorality, that would not imply that the theory of evolution was false. It's quite astonishing how many people cannot grasp this simple point of logic. The fallacy is so common it even has a name: argumentum ad consequentiam. X is true or false because of how much I like or dislike its consequences. Is the production of the higher animals really the most exalted object which we are capable of conceiving? Most exalted? Really? Aren't there more exalted objects? Art, spirituality, Romeo and Juliet, general relativity, the choral symphony, the Sistine Chapel, love. You have to remember that for all his modesty, Darwin nursed high ambitions. On his worldview, everything about the human mind, all our emotions and spiritual pretensions, all arts and mathematics, philosophy and music, all feats of intellect and exertions of spirit result from the same process that delivered the higher animals. It's not just that without evolved brains, spirituality and music would be impossible. More pointedly, brains were naturally selected to increase in capacity and power for utilitarian reasons. Unlike those higher faculties of intellect and spirit, which emerged as a byproduct and blossomed in the cultural environment provided by group living and language. The Darwinian worldview does not denigrate the higher human faculties, doesn't reduce them to a plane of indignity. It doesn't even claim to explain them at the sort of level that will seem particularly satisfying, in the way that, say, the Darwinian explanation of a tiger's teeth is satisfying. But it does claim to have wiped out the impenetrable, not even worth trying to penetrate, mystery that must have dogged all efforts to understand in pre-Darwinian times. Whatever we think about that, does the production of the higher animals directly follow from the war of nature, from famine and death? Well, yes, it does. It directly follows, if you understand Darwin's reasoning. But nobody understood it until the 19th century, and many still don't understand it, or perhaps are reluctant to do so. It's not hard to see why. When you think about it, our existence, together with its post-Darwinian explicability, is a candidate for the most astonishing fact that any of us are called upon to contemplate in our whole life ever. I've lost count of the number of irate letters I've received from readers of books in which I've quoted Darwin's famous last paragraph, taking me to task for, as the writers think, deliberately omitting the vital phrase, "by the Creator," after having been originally breathed. Am I not wantonly distorting Darwin's intention? These zealous correspondents forget that Darwin's great book went through 6 editions. In the first edition, the sentence is as I've written it here, having been originally breathed into a few forms or into one. Darwin inserted "by the Creator" in the second and all subsequent editions. Unless there's a very good reason to the contrary, whenever I quote The Origin of Species, I always quote the first edition. This is partly because my own copy of that historic print run of 1,250 is one of my most precious possessions, given me by my benefactor and friend Charles Simoni. But it's also because the first edition is the most historically important. It's the one that thumped the Victorian solar plexus and drove out the wind of centuries. And later editions, especially the 6th, pandered to more than public opinion. In an attempt to respond to various learned but misguided critics of the first edition, Darwin backtracked and even reversed his position on a number of important points. He'd actually got right in the first edition. So for my money, having been originally breathed it is, with no mention of any creator. It seems that Darwin actually regretted this sop to religious opinion. In a letter of 1863 to his friend Hooker, the botanist, he said, "But I have long regretted that I truckled to public opinion and used the Pentateuchal term of creation, by which I really meant appeared by some wholly unknown process." Nowadays, we should even dispense with the originally breathed. What is it that's supposed to have been breathed into what? Presumably the intended reference was to some kind of breath of life. But what might that mean? The harder we look at the border between life and non-life, the more elusive does the distinction become. Life, the animate, was supposed to have some sort of vibrant, throbbing quality, some vital essence, made to sound yet more mysterious when dropped into French, élan vital. Life, it seemed, was made of a special living substance, a witch's brew called protoplasm. Conan Doyle's Professor Challenger, a fictional character even more preposterous than Sherlock Holmes, discovered that the earth was living, a kind of giant sea urchin, with its shell being the crust that we see and its core comprising pure protoplasm. Right up to the middle of the 20th century, life was thought to be qualitatively beyond physics and chemistry, but no longer. The difference between life and non-life is a matter not of substance, but of information. Living things contain prodigious quantities of information, digital information. The information is digitally coded in DNA, and there's a substantial quantity coded in other ways, as we shall see. To get an idea of the dramatic impact of the molecular biology revolution, the Watson-Crick revolution, on our own attitude to life, listen to this. It's the last paragraph of an authoritative short history of biology written by Charles Singer in 1931. Quote, "Despite interpretations to the contrary, the theory of the gene is not a mechanist theory. The gene is no more comprehensible as a chemical or physical entity than is the cell, or for that matter, the organism itself. Further, though the theory speaks in terms of genes as the atomic theory speaks in terms of atoms, it must be remembered that there is a fundamental distinction between the two theories. Atoms exist independently, and their properties as such can be examined. They can even be isolated. Though we cannot see them, we can deal with them under various conditions and in various combinations. We can deal with them individually. Not so the gene. It exists only as a part of the chromosome, and the chromosome only as part of a cell. If I ask for a living chromosome, that is, for the only effective kind of chromosome, no one can give it to me except in its living surroundings, any more than he can give me a living arm or leg. The doctrine of the relativity of functions is as true for the gene as it is for any of the organs of the body. They exist and function only in relation to other organs. Thus, the last of the biological theories leaves us where the first started, in the presence of a power called life or psyche, which is not only of its own kind, but unique in each and all of its exhibitions. This is wrong, dramatically, profoundly, hugely wrong. It really matters. After Watson and Crick and the revolution that they sparked, a gene can be isolated. It can be purified, bottled, crystallized, read as digitally coded information, printed on a page, fed into a computer, read out again into a test tube, and reinserted into an organism where it will work exactly as it did before. That's a truly profound revolution. Wouldn't Darwin have loved it? This is Craig Venter. On the right's what he looks like. On the left is a complete recipe for making a new Craig Venter. And that's literally true. If you were to blow up that page, that would be the complete genome. That is a disk, a CD, which has the whole of Craig Venter's genome on it. That could be buried for 1,000 years, or put into a library for 1,000 years, brought out again, decoded, and an identical twin of Craig Venter could be made. From an evolutionary point of view, the DNA, which is characteristic of any given species, is naturally selected so that it becomes a set of instructions for surviving and reproducing in the normal environment of the species. Bird DNA includes instructions for how to build wings and how to build a nervous system that knows how to fly with those wings. Dolphin DNA includes instructions for how to swim. Aardvark DNA includes instructions for how to dig. Octopus DNA includes instructions for how to change color, and so on. The genetic database of a species becomes a storehouse of information about the environments of the past, environments in which ancestors survived and passed on the genes that helped them to do so. To the extent that present and future environments resemble those of the past, mostly they do, this genetic book of the dead, as I've called it, will turn out to be a useful manual for survival in the present and future. The repository of that information will at any one moment reside in lots of individual bodies, but in the longer term, where reproduction is sexual and DNA is shuffled from body to body, the database of survival instructions will be the gene pool of a species. Each individual's genome in any one generation will be a sample from the species database. Different species have different databases because of their different ancestral worlds. Like sand bluffs carved into fantastic shapes by the desert winds, the database in the gene pool of camels will encode information about deserts and how to survive in them. The DNA in mole gene pools will contain instructions and hints for survival in dark, moist soil. The DNA in predator gene pools will increasingly contain information about prey animals, their evasive tricks, how to outsmart them. The DNA in prey gene pools will come to contain information about predators and how to dodge and outrun them. The DNA in all gene pools contains information about parasites and how to resist their pernicious invasions. Darwin was right to hedge his bets, But today, we're pretty certain that all living creatures on this planet are descended from a single ancestor. The evidence is that the genetic code is universal, all but identical, across animals, plants, fungi, bacteria, archaea, and viruses. I mean the 64-word dictionary by which 3-letter DNA words are translated into 20 amino acids and 1 punctuation mark. It's the same 64-word dictionary wherever you look in the animal kingdom, and indeed all the living kingdoms, with 1 or 2 exceptions. If, say, some weird, anomalous microbes called the harem scariotes were discovered, which didn't use DNA at all, or didn't use proteins, or used proteins but strung them together from a different set of amino acids from the familiar 20, or which used DNA but not a triplet code, or a triplet code but not the same 64-word dictionary, if any of those conditions were met, we might suggest that life had originated twice, once for the harem scariotes and once for all the rest of us. For all Darwin knew, and that's why he said that, for all that Darwin knew, some existing creatures might have had the properties I've here attributed to the harem scariotes, in which case his into a few forms would have been justified. Is it possible that 2 independent origins of life could have both hit upon the same 64-word code? It's possible, but very unlikely. For that to be plausible, the existing code would have to have very strong advantages over alternative codes, and there would have to be a gradual ramp of improvement, a ramp for natural selection to steadily climb up, and both those conditions are improbable. Francis Crick suggested that the genetic code is a frozen accident, which once in place was difficult or impossible to change, and the reasoning is interesting. Any mutation in the genetic code itself, as opposed to just mutations in the genes that it encodes, any mutation in the actual code, the actual dictionary, would have an instantly catastrophic effect, not just in one place, but throughout the whole organism. If any word in the 64-word dictionary changed its meaning so that it came to specify a different amino acid, then just about every protein in the body would instantaneously change, probably many times over. So unlike an ordinary mutation, which might, say, lengthen a leg or shorten a wing or darken an eye, a change in the code itself would change everything at once all over the body, and this would be disaster. Various theories have come up with suggestions for special ways in which the genetic code might evolve, ways in which, to quote one of them, the frozen accident might be thawed. These are interesting, but I think it's all but certain that every living creature whose genetic code has been looked at is descended from one common ancestor. No matter how elaborate and different the high-level programs that underlie the various life forms are, they all are written in the same machine language at bottom. We can't rule out the possibility that other machine languages may have arisen in other creatures that are now extinct. The equivalent of the harem scariotes may once have lived. The physicist Paul Davies has made the reasonable point that we haven't actually looked very hard to see if there are any harem scariotes, he didn't use that word, but any independently evolved creatures that are not extinct but still lurking in some extreme redoubt of our planet. He admits it's not very likely, but he argues along the same lines as the man who searches for his keys under a lamppost, because that's the only place where there's any light, although he didn't actually lose them there. I don't mind recording my private expectation that Professor Davies won't find anything, and that all surviving forms on this planet use the same machine code. They're derived from the same common ancestor. Whilst this planet has gone cycling on according to the fixed law of gravity, I'm just going on through the lines. Humanity was aware of the cycles that govern our lives from long before we understood them. The most obvious cycle is the day-night cycle. Objects floating in space or orbiting other objects have a natural tendency to spin on their own axis, and our planet is one of them, of course. its period of rotation is now 24 hours. It used to be faster, and we experience it as night follows day. Gravity mediates other cycles that also matter to life. They're less obvious. Unlike other planets that have many satellites, often relatively small, Earth happens to have a single large satellite, which we call the Moon. It's large enough to exert a significant gravitational effect in its own right. And we experience this in the cycle of tides, principally. Some people have suggested that there's a kind of race memory of the monthly lunar cycle, and wolves howling at the moon and things like that. I think it's probably, well, it's an interesting possibility. By the way, I was shocked to read the other day that a poll showed that I think it was 18% of the British people think that it takes 1 month for the Earth to orbit the Sun. In one respect, I found that actually quite encouraging, because it suggests to me that the sort of opposition that we have in the teaching of evolution may be a symptom of a general abysmal ignorance of science rather than a specific opposition to evolution. If that's comforting, I don't know. What if the Earth didn't spin? What if it didn't spin on its axis? If it kept one face permanently towards the Sun, as the Moon keeps one face permanently towards us? Could life survive, perhaps in the twilight hinterland between the roasting hell of the daylight side and the insufferable cold of the night side? Conceivably, life is pretty resilient. I doubt if life could ever have originated on such a planet, but maybe if it happened now, it could go on. What if the Earth spun, but on an axis that wasn't tilted? I doubt if that would rule life out. There'd be no summer-winter cycle. Summer and winter conditions would be a function of latitude and altitude, but not time. Winter would be the permanent season experienced by creatures living close to the poles, either of the poles, or up high mountains. I don't see why that should rule life out, but life without seasons would be less interesting. There'd be no incentive to migrate or to breed at any particular time, or to shed leaves or molt or hibernate or any of the other things that happen seasonally. What if the planet were not in orbit around a star at all? Then life, I think, would be completely impossible. The only alternative to orbiting a star is hurtling through the void, dark, close to absolute zero temperature, alone, far from the source of energy that enables life to trickle upstream, temporally and locally, against the thermodynamic torrent. So Darwin's use of cycling on according to the fixed law of gravity is more than just a poetic device to express the relentless and unimaginably extended passage of time. Why is a source of energy such as the sun so important? I don't know if that's the Onion or genuine. You can't tell nowadays. It's If anybody can't read it, it's a demonstration against entropy. Christian right lobbies to overturn second law of thermodynamics. I don't accept fundamental tenets of science, and I vote. The laws of thermodynamics state that although energy can neither be created nor destroyed, it must, in a closed system, become more impotent to do useful work. That's what it means to say that entropy increases. Work includes things like pumping water uphill, or the chemical equivalent, extracting carbon from atmospheric carbon dioxide and using it in plant tissues. Both those feats can be achieved only if energy is fed into the system. For example, electrical energy to drive the water pump, or solar energy to drive the synthesis of sugar and starch in a green plant. Once the water has been pumped to the top of the hill, it will then tend to flow downhill, and some of the energy of its downward flow can be used to drive a water wheel, which can generate electricity, which can drive an electric motor to pump some of the water uphill again, but only some. Some of the energy is always lost, they're never destroyed. Perpetual motion machines, you can't say this too often or too dogmatically, are impossible. In life's chemistry, the carbon extracted from the air by the sun-driven uphill chemical reactions in plants can be burned to release some of the energy. We can literally burn it in the form of coal or oil, which you can think of as stored solar energy, having been put there long ago by the solar panels of long-dead plants. Or the energy may be released in a more controlled way than actual combustion, actual burning. Inside living cells, either of plants or animals that eat plants, sunburned carbon compounds are slow burned. They don't literally burst into flames, they give up their energy in a serviceable trickle, where it works in a controlled manner to drive uphill chemical reactions. Inevitably, some of this energy is wasted as heat. If it were not, we'd again have a perpetual motion machine, which is, and once again, you can't say it too often, impossible. Almost all the energy in the universe is steadily being degraded from forms that are capable of doing work to forms that are incapable of doing work. There's a leveling off, a mixing up, until eventually the entire universe will settle into a uniform, uneventful, literally, heat death. But while the universe as a whole is hurtling downhill towards its inevitable heat death, there's scope for small quantities of energy to drive little local systems in the opposite direction. Water from the sea is lifted into the air as clouds, which later deposit their water on mountain tops, from which it runs downhill in streams and rivers, which can drive water wheels or electric power stations. The energy to lift the water, and hence to drive the turbines in power stations and so on, comes from the sun. It's not a violation of the second law, for energy is constantly being fed in from the sun. The sun's energy is doing something similar in green leaves, driving chemical reactions locally uphill to make sugar and starch and cellulose and plant tissues. Eventually the plants die, or they may be eaten by animals. The trapped solar energy has the opportunity to trickle down through numerous cascades, through a long and complex food chain, culminating in bacterial, fungal decay of the plants or of the animals that prolong the food chain for a while. Or some of the energy may be sequestered underground, first as peat and then as coal. But the universal trend towards ultimate heat death is never reversed. In every link of the food chain, through every trickle-down cascade within every cell, some of the energy is degraded to uselessness. Perpetual motion machines are... Okay, that's enough. I won't apologize for repeating it, but I'm going to quote one more time, I've done this before, a marvelous saying of Sir Arthur Eddington, the famous astronomer and popularizer of science. He said, "If someone points out to you that your pet theory of the universe is in disagreement with Maxwell's equations, then so much the worse for Maxwell's equations. If it is found to be contradicted by observation, well, these experimentalists do bungle things sometimes. But if your theory is found to be against the second law of thermodynamics, I can give you no hope. There is nothing for it but to collapse in deepest humiliation." By the way, I used the phrase Eddington concession for this rhetorical ploy of giving something away, this preposterous idea that your theory might go against Maxwell's equations or against experimental physics. It's not totally preposterous. The point is that there is something even more preposterous than that. And this is the Eddington concession. You're leading up to the point you really want to make, in Eddington's case, that you can't buck the second law of thermodynamics, by making a very, very generous concession by contrast. And I'm starting to learn that the Eddington concession is a dangerous thing to employ. I used it in a debate with a man called John Lennox in Oxford, and I wanted to bring home the absurdity of John Lennox's belief in Jesus turning water into wine, Jesus walking on water, the virgin birth, and things like that. Because I discovered that this man, who purports to be a sophisticated theologian, actually believes in those infantile miracles. And so in order to drum that home, I began by saying, this was my Eddington concession, I began by saying, I could imagine that a serious case might be made for deism, for the idea that some kind of supernatural intelligence devised the laws of physics and set the universe going. It's not a case I would accept myself, but I could imagine a serious case being made. But John Lennox believes in walking on water, turning water into wine, and so on. You see how I was using the Eddington concession. What happened? Not only John Lennox, but a woman called Melanie Phillips, whose name may be known to some of you, trumpeted, Dawkins has become a deist. And that's absolutely seriously true. So, although the Eddington concession is an effective rhetorical device, it can backfire. Back to thermodynamics. When creationists say, as they frequently do, that the theory of evolution contradicts the second law of thermodynamics, they're telling us no more than that they don't understand the second law. We already knew that they don't understand evolution. There is no contradiction because of the sun. You can read the red at the bottom, can you? I'm not bothering to read out the thing now. I'm not sure what Darwin meant by endless when he said endless forms most beautiful. It could have been just a superlative deployed to soup up most beautiful and most wonderful. I expect that was part of it. But I like to think that Darwin meant something more particular by endless. As we look back on the history of life, we see a picture of never-ending, ever-rejuvenating novelty. Individuals die, and species, families, orders, and even classes go extinct. But the evolutionary process itself seems to pick itself up and resume its recurrent flowering with undiminished freshness, unabated youthfulness as epoch gives way to epoch. The fact of our own existence is almost too surprising to bear. So is the fact that we're surrounded by a rich ecosystem of animals that more or less closely resemble us, by plants that resemble us a little and on which we ultimately depend for our nourishment, by bacteria that resemble our remoter ancestors and to which we shall all return in decay when our time is past. Darwin was ahead of his time in understanding the magnitude of the problem of our existence, as well as in tumbling to its solution. He was ahead of his time, too, in appreciating the mutual dependencies of animals and plants and all other creatures in relationships whose intricacy staggers the imagination. How is it that we find ourselves not merely existing, but surrounded by such complexity, such elegance, such endless forms, most beautiful and most wonderful? The answer is this: it could not have been otherwise, given that we are capable of noticing our existence at all and of asking questions about it. It is no accident, as cosmologists point out to us, that we see stars in our sky. There may be universes without stars in them, universes whose physical laws and constants leave the primordial hydrogen evenly spread and not concentrated into stars. But nobody is observing those universes, because entities capable of observing anything cannot evolve without stars. Not only does life need at least one star to provide energy, stars are also the furnaces in which the majority of the chemical elements are forged, and you can't have life without a rich chemistry. We could go through all the laws of physics one by one and say the same thing of all of them. It is no accident that we see so-and-so, because if so-and-so wasn't true, we wouldn't be here to see anything. And the same is true of biology. It's no accident that we see green almost everywhere we look. It's no accident that we find ourselves perched on one tiny twig in the midst of a blossoming, flourishing tree of life. No accident that we're surrounded by millions of other species, eating, growing, rotting, swimming, walking, copulating, flying, burrowing, stalking, chasing, fleeing, outpacing, outwitting. Without green plants to outnumber us at least 10 to 1, there would be no energy to power us. Without the ever-escalating arms races between predators and prey, parasites and hosts, without Darwin's war of nature, without Darwin's famine and death, there would be no nervous systems capable of seeing anything at all, capable of appreciating and understanding it. We are surrounded by endless forms, most beautiful and most wonderful, and it's no accident, but the direct consequence of evolution by non-random natural selection. The greatest show on earth, the only game in town. Thank you very much.